Okay, it's now my very great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, and I've been particularly looking forward to Monica's talk. But Monica has been a member of JASA for quite some time, and she's a teacher. She's a teacher at a boys' school, so I think you'll be really interested in the talk coming up later this year on the importance of teaching Jane Austen. And she teaches that best of all possible subjects, English literature. So would you please welcome Monica Jarman to talk to us today on Universals and Particulars, Pride and Prejudice Retellings from around the world. Welcome, Monica.
Thank you, Susanna. So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the first storytellers of this land, the Guringai of the Eora Nation. As we tell and explore story, we pay respect to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to thank and acknowledge the committee for all their work in getting today's presentation underway, and particularly Amanda, and I'd like to thank Susanna for this opportunity today. So the purpose of this presentation is to get you excited about a suite of retellings of Pride and Prejudice, all published in the last 2 to 3 years, that celebrate the universality of that narrative in particular ethnic and religious settings. As we know, the Austen verse is able to accommodate enormous diversity. In Austen fan fiction, settings can be modernised and relocated, character values and attributes recalibrated, genders swapped, sexualities altered, and ethnic and religious backgrounds transformed. In today's collection, we will visit Pakistan, Canada, and America. In Ostentation, which a copy is down here at the front if you would have like to have a look later on with copies of the other books I'll be mentioning today. In Ostentation, Ostentatious, the evolving world of Jane Austen fans, Holly Lukenhaus and Zoe Weinstein ask the reader to think about the stereotypical Austen fan. What does this person look like? What gender, age, socioeconomic status? I would bet they write that the majority of people imagine a typical Austen fan as female, middle-aged or older, and middle class. She is also likely white. This is true of me, and I think it is true in general. But I would argue, based on the books I'm about to share with you, increasingly less so. Take a look at the recent mini-series of Sanditon that Susanna has just mentioned, and that made me scurry back to the original text for this information in chapter 10. She, Miss Lamb, was about 17, half mulatto, chilly and tender, had a maid of her own, was to have the best room in the lodgings, and was always of the first consequence in every plan of Mrs. Griffiths. Austen invites us to think about race, perhaps not in terms that we would use today, but Sanditon is certainly aware of and willing to celebrate the inevitable conversations about race that will emerge from a colonial empire. And contemporary Austen fan fiction is very keen to participate in and extend this conversation. As Lukenhaus and Weinstein argue, Jane Austen fan fiction, like Jane Austen herself, is subversive but also inclusive. They ask why it is that people write Austen fan fiction, and the answer is that these fan creations can actually make Austen more complex, relatable, and interesting for a contemporary audience. Furthermore, the act of inserting race into books such as Austen's also serves as a way for fans to explore, develop, and experience their own identities. It is well documented that people identify most with characters that look like or remind them of themselves. At this point, I was going to talk about Bridgerton. And Susanna is right. The blind colour casting is incredibly interesting. You have a black Queen Charlotte on the throne, and you have Asian and brown and black men and women in the court, in the nobility, but also in the middle classes and in the servant classes as well. It's interesting that there's very little commentary upon this circumstance. It's not until episode 4 that Lady Danbury, a black matriarch figure, draws attention to this representation. Look at our queen, look at our king, look at their marriage, look at everything it is doing for us, allowing us to become. We were two separate societies divided by colour until a king fell in love with one of us. And then the series goes back to being seemingly oblivious to colour, but as Lukenhaus and Weinstein argue, people of colour, viewers of colour, are able to explore, develop and experience their own identities, identifying most with characters that look like or remind them of themselves. So it is this need for the writers of these Austen retellings to make a connection between themselves, their sense of themselves, and Austen's writings that I want to share with you today. This need to write themselves into what they have read is apparent, not only in the fictions that I'm about to share with you, but also in what the authors have to say about their motivations for writing in the Austenverse in a way that addresses the complexities of questions of race. Really, what these authors want to do, and what they share in common, is a desire to celebrate their own identities and to celebrate Austen in the same breath. I'll start with Sonali Dev's essay to her novel, Pride and Prejudice and Other Flavours, published in 2019. Dev writes, "The fact that I can relate so viscerally to Austen's heroines is bizarre, even ironic, given that her heroines lived in a time when her country had enslaved mine, while proliferating the theme that East is East and West is West, and never the twain shall meet." But then that's the genius of Austen, isn't it? Her themes and conflicts are so human, they cross cultural boundaries, and they haven't lost any of their relevance over time. The underlying motivations and failings themselves have remained unchanged. In other words, there is a universality to Austen's depiction of the human experience that transcends time and place. And it is this very universality, the global reach of Austen, achieved through the cultural hegemony obtained by English culture and English literature through the English colonial empire, that gives space to Dev and these other writers to make Austen more complex and relatable by making Austen particular, by inserting their own responses to an extension of Austen into their retellings. Similarly, Sonia Kamal's afterword to Unmarriageable, Pride and Prejudice in Pakistan, from where I stole the title for this presentation, points to Austen's universality. Kamal, who now lives in the US, grew up reading classic English poets and novelists as a child educated in Pakistan's English medium system and in an international boarding school in Saudi Arabia. What drew her to Austen was her social criticism, conveyed through her pithy wit. And Kamal found that here was a centuries-old writer that may as well have been writing about contemporary Pakistani society. In a country where marriages continue to be arranged on the basis of convenience, pedigrees and bank balances, Elizabeth's spurning of the self-righteous Mr. Collins and the pompous Mr. Darcy were defiant acts we could look up to. As I read and reread Pride and Prejudice, Elizabeth Bennet and every other character ceased to be English. To me, they were Pakistani. Thus, Jane Bennet became just another Pakistani girl, watching out for her reputation by being reticent instead of flirtatious, and her sadness at being spurned was no different from anyone's anywhere. So Kamal has written a parallel retelling. The plot and characters are pretty much the same, but asserted the particulars of her culture, the settings, food, clothing, literary references, local events, and even cultural questions about language particular to Pakistan. And it is these questions about representation of identity through language that are central to Kamal's Unmarriageable, also published in 2019. Kamal's first epigraph to her novel quotes Austen's letter to Cassandra, in which she ironically complains that Pride and Prejudice does not deal with the big issues of the day. Upon the whole, however, I am well satisfied enough. The work is rather too light and bright and sparkling. It wants shade. It wants to be stretched out here and there with a long chapter of sense if it could be had, if not of solemn, specious nonsense about something unconnected with the story, an essay on writing, a critique on Walter Scott, or the history of Bonaparte, or anything that would form a contrast and bring the reader with increased delight to the playfulness and epigrammatism of the general style. Kamal's second epigraph highlights Pride and Prejudice's own political context and the elasticity of the novel to be inclusive of our contemporary complexities. This epigraph is taken from Thomas Babington Macaulay's highly influential Minute on Education from 1835, which became government policy in India. Macaulay argues vehemently that colonisation would be most effective if English and the intrinsic superiority of Western literature were to replace the inferior literature of India and Arabia. It is possible to make natives of this country thoroughly good English scholars, and to this end our efforts ought to be directed. We must at present do our best to form a class who may be interpreters between us and the millions whom we govern, a class of persons Indian in blood and colour, but English in tastes, in opinions, in morals and in intellect. Devon Kamal's commentaries alert the reader to the complexities they have experienced when reading and writing English, when English is their language, but not necessarily the totality of their identities. Unmarriageable weaves an exploration of this complexity into Kamal's retelling. So let's look a bit more closely at what Unmarriageable has to say about writing in a language, English, that is, but is not entirely, one's own. Elise Binat is Pakistani and Muslim, living in the fictional city of Dalipabad with her mother, father and 4 sisters. She is an English speaker and therefore sometimes known as a burgher, the derogatory term used to describe Pakistanis who predominantly went about their lives in fluent English by Pakistanis who predominantly went about their lives in fluent Urdu or regional dialect. She is a teacher of high school and literature, English literature, although she favours comparative or analogous literary studies. For example, she would pair E.M. Forster's A Passage to India with Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird for similar racial issues and court cases. She argues that the emotions and situations in the characters of O'Connor, Austen, Alcott and Wharton are universally applicable across cultures, whether you're wearing an empire dress, shalwar kurta or kimono. In Unmarriageable, the tension between Elise and her Darcy explores the complexity around the use of English in Pakistan and the writing of Pakistani literature in English. We all know that a really accomplished woman adds something more substantial in the improvement of her mind by extensive reading. Elisa's Darcy equivalent, Valentine Darcy's Meriton comment, concerns her reading material, which is on first impressions, apparently composed of Reader's Digest and Good Housekeeping. Her first impressions are that she is just not smart enough to tempt him. However, with further book talk, they discover a shared interest in working through the conundrum of Sonali Dev's observation that Austen's country had linguistically enslaved Pakistan while proliferating the theme of East is East and West is West and never the twain shall meet. Elise and Darcy, both partially educated outside Pakistan and educated in English, see themselves as able to recognise that all cultures were concerned with the same eternal questions and that people were more similar to one another than they were different. In other words, that the particulars of East can meet the particulars of West because of the universality of the human experience. Here's an extract from an early conversation about their reading and its impact upon their sense of self and identity. I believe, Elise said to Darcy, a book and an author can belong to more than one country or culture. English came with the colonisers, but its literature is part of our heritage too, as is pre-partition writing. Darcy said, my favourite partition novel is Atiya Hussein's Sunlight on a Broken Column. Have you read it, Elise? Elise shook her head. That book made me believe I could have a Pakistani identity inclusive of an English-speaking tongue. We've been forced to seek ourselves in the literature of others for too long. Elise nodded, adding, but reading widely can lead to an appreciation of the universalities across cultures. Sure, Darcy said, but it shouldn't just be a one-sided appreciation. I know what you mean, Elise said. Ginger ale and apple pie have become second nature to us here, while our culture is viewed as exotic. Precisely, Darcy said. At the wedding you talked of a Pakistani Jane Austen, but will we ever hear the English or Americans talk of an equivalent? Let's hope so, Elise said. Elise continues the conversation with the Wickham character as they watch the border closing ceremony between Pakistan and India. Elise gave a small smile. I wrestle with how to incorporate history. Can any amount of good ever merit the interference of empire? Do we never speak English again, not read the literature? Erasing history is not the answer. So how does a country put the lasting effects of empire in proper context? Not deny it, but not unnecessarily celebrate it. Wickham shrugged, best to concentrate on the future. But the future is built on a past, good and bad. It's troubling when someone takes a book and makes a shoddy film out of it, and then comes the day when no one has read the book and everyone thinks the shoddy film is the original. Come now, Wickham winked. You have to admit that films are better than books. The fact that Wickham cannot engage with the questions that Elise raises should raise alarm bells. Without intellectual chemistry, a shared intellectual curiosity about identity, and the language used to express one's identity in Pakistan, then Elise should let Wickham go and continue the conversation with Darcy, and thankfully she does. Darcy concludes, we like reading and we have growing up abroad in common. We both grew up multicultural kids. We know no one person represents a group or a country in things good or bad. We know how to plant roots where there are none. We know that friends can be made anywhere and everywhere, regardless of race or religion. We know how to uproot. We know how to move on from memories, or at least not let memories bury us. Elise and Darcy, through their conversations and through their final union, symbolised the future that Elise was trying to engage Wickham in as they stood symbolically on the Pakistani-Indian border. And I think that future recognises the impossibility of shifting colonial history and its impact upon the language and literature of colonised nations, the impossibility of erasing a literature written in English from the Pakistani canon, and the impossibility of ignoring the lived experience and identity of English-speaking Pakistanis. But it is a future in which East meets West. Kamal concurs in her afterword to Unmarriageable. I wanted to write a novel that paid homage to Jane Austen and Pride and Prejudice, as well as combined my braided identification with English language and Pakistani culture, so that the literature of others became the literature of everyone, therefore unmarriageable. Whilst Unmarriageable explores the complexities for English-speaking Pakistanis, Ayesha at last jumps right into the complexities that arise when a diversity of ethnicities and religions live and work and love in community. Ayesha at Last by Uzma Jalaluddin is set amongst a Muslim community in Canada's Toronto. Ayesha Shamsi is 28 years old and lives in Toronto with her younger brother, mother and grandparents. So we're dealing more with an appropriation of Pride and Prejudice rather than a parallel narrative. She immigrated from India to Canada with her family after the death of her journalist father, who was covering religious sectarian violence in India. As the novel, she is starting her first day of substitute teaching, and it does not go well. She would rather be writing poetry. In her spare time, she volunteers at the local mosque, helping to organise the Muslims in Action Youth Conference with, you guessed it, our Darcy character, Khalid Mirza. Now, Khalid is potentially a much more interesting character than Elizabeth Ayesha. Surprise, surprise. Darcy Khalid too is Muslim, Canadian-born with an Indian heritage, and his father has only recently died. He's just moved into the same neighbourhood as Ayesha, across the road, with his mother, who resembles Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Khalid is a complex and relatable character because of his work situation. And it is when the novel touches on Khalid's conflicts at work that we as readers are invited to think most deeply about Sonali Dev's paradox. The fact that I can relate so viscerally to Austen's heroines is bizarre, even ironic, given that her heroines lived in a time when her country had enslaved mine while proliferating the theme of East is East and West is West, and never the twain shall meet. Khalid's conflicts at work arise from Jalaluddin's interrogation of this theme, that East and West cannot live in mutuality, and her rendering of the lived reality of racism and prejudice for people of colour and religious diversity in the workplace. Unlike Austen, Jalaluddin provides a physical description of Khalid early in the novel. Khalid was dressed in his usual work attire, full-sleeve white robe that skimmed his ankles, black dress pants, white skull cap jammed over dark brown hair that curled over his ears. His beard was long and luxuriously thick, contrasting sharply with his pale olive complexion. He was a large man, tall and broad. Jalaluddin has to provide this description so that the reader can picture Darcy Khalid in a way similar to Ayesha. Ayesha describes Khalid to her friend Charlotte Lucas / Clara. He's the kind of guy who scares people in shopping malls and gets randomly searched at airports. Khalid is a fundamentalist. He'll stick out wherever he goes. I don't want any of that. If Ayesha, a fellow Muslim, is prepared to deride Khalid as a bearded fundi, then the reader is similarly invited to dislike Khalid, the Darcy character. However, I think that this reaction is challenged when we see Khalid at work, remembering that Ayesha does not see Khalid at work. And the reader is witness to his mistreatment at the hands of his new boss, Sheila Watts, otherwise known as Sheila the Shark. Sheila's short time living and working in Saudi Arabia colours her interaction with Khalid, Ayesha's bearded fundi. I'd like to read you a section from the novel that's concerned with Khalid's dealings with Sheila in the workplace. Khalid is walking down a narrow hallway at work when he comes across his co-worker Clara, Ayesha's Charlotte Lucas, who's just stepped into the role of Regional Manager of Human Resources, reporting to Sheila. The door behind Clara opened and a petite woman with black hair and blue eyes stepped out. She was shorter than Clara, dressed in a sleeveless top and tight black pencil skirt. Above her right breast was pinned a large crystal brooch in the shape of a spider. Its winking red eyes matched her lipstick. Clara stepped forward with a friendly smile. "Sheila, I wanted to introduce myself. I'm Clara Taylor. John promoted me before he left for company." Sheila looked at the outstretched hand and beaming face before her. A faint expression of distaste lurked at her lips, and she briefly shook Clara's hand using only the very tips of her fingers. Khalid knew what was coming next, and he felt powerless to stop it. Usually, when he was introduced to female clients and co-workers, he had time to prepare beforehand with a carefully worded email about his no-touch rule. As the women talked, he subtly edged away from their conversation, taking tiny steps down the hall. But it was no use. Clara's friendliness foiled his escape. "Sheila, this is our e-commerce project manager, Khalid Mirza," she said, and both women turned to him. A hard glance from Sheila took in Khalid's white robe and skull cap. Her eyes lingered on his long beard. Her gaze was the opposite of appraising, Khalid thought. She looked annoyed. Then everything went from bad to worse. "I'm sorry, I don't shake hands with women. It's against my religion," he blurted. Sheila left her hand outstretched for another moment. Cold eyes locked on his face. Then she slowly pulled back and raised an eyebrow. "I should have assumed as much from your clothing. Tell me, Khalid, where are you from?" "Toronto," Khalid answered. His face flamed beneath his thick beard. He didn't know where to look. "No," Sheila laughed lightly. "I mean, where are you from originally?" "Toronto," Khalid responded again, and this time his voice was resigned. Clara shifted, looking tense and uncomfortable. "I'm originally from Newfoundland," she said brightly. "I lived in the Middle East for a while," Sheila said to Khalid, her voice low and pleasant. "Saudi Arabia. I found it so interesting that the women wore black while the men wore white. There's something symbolic about that, isn't there? Half the population in shadow while the rest live in light. You must be so grateful to live in a country that welcomes everybody." Sheila's laughter sounded high and artificial. "Of course. When I was in Saudi Arabia, I wasn't afforded the same courtesy." Khalid's eyes were lowered to the ground, his head bowed. "I apologise, Miss Watts. I meant no disrespect," he said finally. "Please forgive me." He turned around and walked back the way he had come, hands trembling. This awkward encounter is swiftly followed by a performance review of Khalid initiated by Sheila the Shark. Sheila continued, "Khalid, let me start off by saying that according to your employee records, your performance has been consistently acceptable. Clara has talked to many of your co-workers and everyone said you are an asset to the team. I called this meeting because I wanted to discuss a few matters. I believe in a transparent work relationship between management and employees." Clara took a deep breath and seemed to plunge in. "As the regional manager of HR, Khalid, I think it's important to hear Sheila's concerns. In particular, she has some thoughts about your emphasis on religion in the workplace." "What do you mean?" Khalid asked, taken aback. "Are you comfortable reporting to a female director?" Clara asked, her eyes conveying a subtle warning. Khalid was confused. "I have no problem working with women. I have no wish to cause discomfort through my actions or words." Clara gave Khalid an encouraging smile before she continued. "Since we are on this topic, I also wanted to bring to your attention to the Live Tech employee dress code. Sheila is concerned that your cultural clothing stands out in a work environment. We want to ensure that you feel comfortable with your colleagues. As a member of the Live Tech executive team, you are required to look professional at all times, Sheila added, her eyes flicking to Khalid's white robe and beard. She smiled stiffly at him. We have to present a united front to our clients. Khalid looked down at his clothes, heart sinking. Not this again. I don't understand the problem, he said, keeping his voice flat. If you can wear a dress to work, why can't I? Both women, momentarily speechless, stared at him. He forced himself to stand despite his shaking legs. Clara, Sheila, thank you for your concern, but I am very happy at Live Tech. I must return to my office to attend to urgent matters. He nearly ran for the door, closing it firmly behind him. The women exchanged glances. Clara was chagrined and embarrassed. Sheila, furious. I'm very disappointed with your performance today, Sheila said. His co-workers must be covering for him. Clara gathered her files and tried to keep the note of impatience from her voice. I talked to everyone he's ever worked with. People find him a little odd, but he's also reliable and hardworking. If you get rid of him, he might sue for religious intolerance. My advice would be to leave him alone. Clara's advice to Sheila is to avoid a legal complication with Khalid, and she goes on to speak a language that she hopes Sheila will understand, suggesting that studies have consistently demonstrated that diversity among employees leads to greater creativity and higher profits. Sheila is left muttering something about removing the rotten apples from the orchard. Whilst Jalaluddin creates a humorous character in Khalid Darcy and his social awkwardness, the novel continues to interrogate the complex relationship of East and West, particularly for Muslim Indians living in Canada, making friends with Canadians, but also their co-religionists who interpret and live their faith in a variety of ways. How will the more orthodox Khalid find happiness with the faithful but more open to Western influences and experiences, Aisha? You'll have to read this intriguing and funny novel to find out. The question of how best to navigate the complexities of race is interrogated by Pride and Prejudice and Other Flavours by Sonali Dev, which is thematically inspired by the original, creating an arrogant female Darcy, known as Trisha, and a male Elizabeth, known as DJ, Darcy James. Trisha is Indian American, and DJ is English, with a Rwandan mother and an Anglo-Indian father, whose family disowned him when he married a Rwandan because it had taken my father's family a few generations to wash the brown out of them. So by marrying Mum, my father basically nullified a half-century's worth of effort for whitening up the Cain line. Trisha's mother and father also illustrate the tensions that can exist within families when it's narrated that Trisha's mother believed their heritage was their greatest strength, and the more they stayed connected to their Indian roots, the more comfortable they'd be in their skin. However, Trisha's father advises his children to get involved in their local community because people have always and will always migrate, and they need to participate fully in the country in which they happen to be living. This is our home. This country is yours. Take everything you need. Give everything you have. We've claimed land, and let it claim us. This place called to me. I'm here, it's mine, and now it's yours. The reality of just how complex race relations are in America is illustrated when DJ is almost arrested for breaking into a car. Trisha has left the keys inside a borrowed Porsche, and she appears to assume that DJ can jimmy the locked car open with a wire coat hanger. DJ does not want to break into the car, nor to be seen breaking into the car, preferring to wait for a mechanic, because he anticipates the consequences, to which Trisha seems oblivious. DJ accuses her of acting white, and fumes that she is a clueless, overprivileged brown girl who had no idea she was brown. Trisha is shaken by the encounter with the police and confronted by the calm with which DJ deals with the situation, whilst observing his underlying anger. In all Trisha's interactions with him, she had felt a blaze of assertiveness under his very polished veneer, an almost immovable self-possession. When the cop had touched his gun, all that confidence had fizzled like a candle doused with a flood. It had been snuffed out without so much as a hiss of smoke. This scene reminds the reader that whilst the romance plot of Pride and Prejudice might be universal, these particular retellings, in particular times and places, respond to their contexts and settings, and so readers find complex and relatable situations in which particular questions of race are raised. Pride, a Pride and Prejudice remix by Evie Savoy, is a young adult parallel post-text set in contemporary Bushwick in New York's Brooklyn amongst the Afro-Latino community. Zuri Benitez is in her second last year of high school, a performance poet and desperate to attend Howard University, an historically black university in Washington, D.C. She's incredibly proud of her racial heritage and her local community, and the novel is peppered with celebrations of her heritage. For example, then the block party and the music will move in, and everyone will eat and dance late into the night. It's one of my favourite days of the year. And it's like a smaller version of my other favourite days, going to the Dominican Day Parade with Puppy and the Puerto Rican Day Parade with Madrina, and repping the Haitian flag at the West Indian Day Parade with Mama. Our block parties bring everybody in our hood together though. The Dominicans, Haitians, Jamaicans, Puerto Ricans, Mexicans, Panamanians, African Americans and white couples too, who are buying up a lot of the brownstones down the block. My neighbourhood is made of love. Zuri's father is Dominican, her mother is Haitian, and her Darcy, Darius, is African American. Zuri feels confronted by her new neighbours, the Darcys, a middle-class African-American family. They have money and all that that entails. Education at private schools and Ivy League universities, experiences, travel, freedom, assumptions about the achievement of their aspirations, and a different accent and vocabulary. The Darcys are part of the gentrification of Zuri's neighbourhood, and in the end, indirectly responsible for causing her and her family to move at the end of the novel. A little bit like the thread of the entail in Austen's novel, Zuri and her family are squeezed out of their home by developers, and it is this move away from her community of diversity and love that is one of the situations that causes the friction between Zuri and her Darcy, Darius. As they attempt to reconcile their socioeconomic differences, they begin to explain themselves to each other, and the complexities of race are explored. Zuri begins. I close my eyes for a moment and inhale. Do you see that rent is going up all over the place and people are not getting paid more? Schools are shitty because teachers think we're a lost cause. I'm trying to get into college, but I need financial aid and scholarships because I have 3 more sisters who want to go to college too. And my parents have always been broke. That's why I had a wall up with you. You were moving into my hood from what seemed like a whole different world. We're both quiet for a long minute before he says, I understand, but it's not like I had it easy either. Darius, if my family had your kind of money and this kind of house, my whole life would have been different. After what feels like forever, he says, I never told you this. But we left our old apartment on the Upper East Side because the neighbours had concerns about me and Ainsley. We had lived there since we were toddlers. Everybody thought we were cute when we were in the 3rd grade. But once we got taller and got some bass in our voices, they decided they didn't recognise us anymore. So we decided to move. But I don't know. Sometimes I feel like I don't belong in Bushwick either. I don't fit in anywhere. Like Pride and Prejudice and other flavours, the realities of contemporary racial politics in America are explored. But unlike Sonali Dev's novel, these questions are complicated by the nexus of race and money and power in Pride, a Pride and Prejudice remix. As the boy writes in her acknowledgements, published in 2018, I wanted to write a love story filled with sweetness and joy and beauty, but our current political situation was a constant noise and distraction. So much was happening in the world, and at times it was hard to focus on the magic of first love. The early drafts of something almost like a love story were a muddy pool of disappointment and anger and fear. I needed an anchor, a structure to hold on to, something that would guide this love story towards healing and reconciliation, if not for the characters themselves, then for me. Austen gifted us with a story about not only love, but class, expectations, and a woman's place in the world, even as she, a woman in 19th century England, had the audacity to write, observe, and speak truth to power with such wit, humour, and grace. Austenistan, edited by Laleen Sakira and published in 2018, is a collection of short stories based on the original novels, all set in contemporary Pakistan, with some visits to the Middle East and the UK. Each short story may begin with an epigraph from the relevant Austen novel, and characters and situations may be the same, but the settings are distinctly, or particularly, Pakistani. However, whilst the names, foods and clothing are Pakistani, and Muslim religious ceremonies, particularly around marriage, are cited, the short stories also include references to Western locations and Western brands. In the short story, The Mughal Empire, by Sania Gura, Pride and Prejudice is told from the point of view of the Caroline Bingley character, here known as Camilla Mughal. She is jealous that the Elizabeth Bennet character, Aram, has been showered with Western designer goodies on her marriage to Faisal Dayan, the Darcy character. Not only had Faisal's mother flown Aram and her mother to London in the Diane's private Gulfstream, she had bought Aram luxuries that most girls could only dream of: Hermes, Chanel, Prada, Manolo Blahnik, Christian Louboutin, Jimmy Choo. All of these references are placed in the context of the rituals of Muslim Pakistani marriages, the matchmakers who organise marriage proposals or rishtas, the Mehndi ceremony wishing the bride prosperity and good luck the night before the wedding, and the nikah or wedding ceremony itself. These short stories have no difficulty in depicting the meeting of East and West in relatable ways. I highly recommend all these texts because, as Elise says in Unmarriageable, Pride and Prejudice in Pakistan, reading widely can lead to an appreciation of the universalities across cultures. Surely that understanding of the commonalities across the human experience can only be for the good. These texts are related by their use of the Pride and Prejudice text to contribute to and extend the conversation about empire and race, the meeting of East and West, that Austen began in one of her last pieces of writing, Sanditon. These novels enter into a dialogue with Austen's original text, and the topic of that conversation is, as Lukenhaus and Weinstein point out, identity, particularly racial and cultural identity. These particular retellings of the universal story of Pride and Prejudice serve as a way for fans to explore, develop and experience their own identities, because it is well documented that people identify most with characters that look like or remind them of themselves. And this is a complex topic, as evidenced by some of the more tense scenes in Pride and Prejudice and Other Flavours, Unmarriageable, Aisha at Last, Pride, a Pride and Prejudice remix, and Austenistan. But it's also a topic that is relatable and interesting for a contemporary audience. And I hope that you too will find these novels to be so. Thank you.
Fascinating, and Monica has, as she said, left the books on the table there for you to have a look at. And thank you for coming. It's lovely to see the numbers getting bigger at every JASA meeting. And again, thank you to Monica for a really thought-provoking presentation. It was wonderful. Thanks.